Chapter 15 of The Flying Inn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicola Kay. The Flying Inn by G.K. Chesterton. Chapter 15. The Songs of the Car Club. More than once, as the car flew through black and silver fairylands of fir wood and pine wood, Dalroy put his head out of the side window and remonstrated with the chauffeur without effect. He was reduced at last to asking him where he was going. "I'm goin' 'ome," said the driver in an undecipherable voice. "I'm a-goin' 'ome to my mar." "And where does she live?" asked Dalroy, with something more like diffidence than he had ever shown before in his life. "Wiles," said the man, "but I ain't seen her since I was born. But she'll do." "You must realize," said Dalroy with difficulty, "that you may be arrested. It's the man's own car. And he's left behind with nothing to eat, so to speak." "'E's got his donkey," grunted the man. "Let the stinker eat his donkey, with thistle sauce. 'E would if 'e was as 'ollow as I was." Humphrey Pump opened the glass window that separated him from the rear part of the car, and turned to speak to his friend over his square elbow and shoulder. "I'm afraid," he said, "he won't stop for anything just yet. He's as mad as Moody's aunt, as they say." "Do they say it?" asked the captain with a sort of anxiety. "They never said it in Ithaca." "Honestly, I think you'd better leave him alone," answered Pump with his sagacious face. "He'd just run us into a Scotch express like Dandy Mutton did, when they said he was driving carelessly. We can send the car back to Ivywood somehow later on, and really I don't think it'll do the gentleman any harm to spend a night with a donkey. The donkey might teach him something, I tell you." "It's true he denied the principle of private property," said Dalroy reflectively. "But I fancy he was thinking of a plain house fixed on the ground. A house on wheels such as this he might perhaps think a more permanent possession. But I never understood it." And again he passed a weary palm across his open forehead. "Have you ever noticed, Hump, what is really odd about those people?" The car shot on amid the comfortable silence of Pump, and then the Irishman said again, "That poet in the pussycat clothes wasn't half bad. Lord Ivywood isn't cruel, but he's inhuman. But that man wasn't inhuman. He was ignorant, like most cultured fellows. But what's odd about them is that they try to be simple and never clear away a single thing that's complicated. If they have to choose between beef and pickles, they always abolish the beef. If they have to choose between a meadow and a motor, they forbid the meadow. Shall I tell you the secret? These men only surrender the things that bind them to other men. Go and dine with a temperance millionaire, and you won't find he's abolished the hors d'oeuvre, or the 5 courses, or even the coffee. What he's abolished is the port and sherry, because poor men like that as well as rich. Go a step farther, and you won't find he's abolished the fine silver forks and spoons, but he's abolished the meat, because poor men like meat when they can get it. Go a step farther, and you won't find he goes without gardens or gorgeous rooms, which poor men can't enjoy at all. But you will find he boasts of early rising, because sleep is a thing poor men can still enjoy. About the only thing they can still enjoy. Nobody ever heard of a modern philanthropist giving up petrol or typewriting or troops of servants. No, no. What he gives up must be some simple and universal thing. He will give up beef, or beer, or sleep, because these pleasures remind him that he is only a man." Humphrey Pump nodded, but still answered nothing. And the voice of the sprawling Dalroy took one of its upward turns of a sort of soaring flippancy which commonly embodied itself in remembering some song he had composed. Such, he said, was the case of the late Mr. Mandragon, so long popular in English aristocratic society as a bluff and simple democrat from the West, until he was unfortunately sandbagged by 6 men whose wives he had shot by private detectives on his incautiously landing on American soil. Mr. Mandragon the millionaire, he wouldn't have wine or wife. He couldn't endure complexity, he lived the simple life. He ordered his lunch by megaphone in manly simple tones, and used all his motors for canvassing voters, and 20 telephones. Besides a dandy little machine, cunning and neat as ever was seen, with 100 pulleys and cranks between, made of iron and kept quite clean, to hoist him out of his healthful bed on every day of his life, and wash him and brush him and shave him and dress him, to live the simple life. Mr. Mandragon was most refined and quietly neatly dressed. Say all the American newspapers that know refinement best. Quiet and neat the hair and hat, and the coat quiet and neat. A trouser worn upon either leg, while boots adorned the feet. And not, as anyone might expect, a tiger skin all striped and specked, and a peacock hat with the tail erect. A scarlet tunic with sunflowers decked, that might have had a more marked effect, and pleased the pride of a weaker man that yearned for wine or wife. But fame and the flagon for Mr. Mandragon obscured the simple life. Mr. Mandragon the millionaire, I am happy to say, is dead. He enjoyed a quiet funeral in a crematorium shed, and he lies there fluffy and soft and grey and certainly quite refined, when he might have rotted to flowers and fruit with Adam and all mankind, or been eaten by bears that fancy blood, or burnt on a big tall tower of wood, in a towering flame as a heathen should, or even sat with us here at food, merrily taking 2-penny rum and cheese with a pocket knife. But these were luxuries lost for him that lived for the simple life. Mr. Pump had made many attempts to arrest this song, but they were as vain as all attempts to arrest the car. The angry chauffeur seemed indeed rather inspired to further energy by the violent vocal noises behind, and Pump again found it best to fall back on conversation. "Well, Captain," he said amicably, "I can't quite agree with you about those things. Of course you can trust foreigners too much, as poor Thompson did. But then you can go too far the other way. Aunt Sarah lost £1,000 that way. I told her again and again he wasn't a nigger, but she wouldn't believe me. And of course that was just the kind of thing to offend an ambassador if he was an Austrian. It seems to me, Captain, you aren't quite fair to these foreign chaps. Take these Americans now. There were many Americans went by Pebblewick, you may suppose. But in all the lot there was never a bad lot, never a nasty American, nor a stupid American, nor, well, never an American that I didn't rather like." "I know," said Dalroy, "you mean there was never an American who did not appreciate the old ship." "I suppose I do mean that," answered the innkeeper, "and somehow I feel the old ship might appreciate the American too." "You English are an extraordinary lot," said the Irishman with a sudden and sombre quietude. "I sometimes feel you may pull through after all." After another silence he said, "You're always right, Hump, and one oughtn't to think of Yankees like that. The rich are the scum of the earth in every country, and a vast proportion of the real Americans are among the most courteous, intelligent, self-respecting people in the world. Some attribute this to the fact that a vast proportion of the real Americans are Irishmen." Pump was still silent, and the Captain resumed in a moment. "All the same," he said, "it's very hard for a man, especially a man of a small country like me, to understand how it must feel to be an American. Especially in the matter of nationality. I shouldn't like to have to write the American national anthem, but fortunately there is no great probability of the commission being given. The shameful secret of my inability to write an American patriotic song is one that will die with me." "Well, what about an English one?" said Pump, sturdily. "You might do worse, Captain." "English, you bloody tyrant," said Patrick, indignantly. "I could no more fancy a song by an Englishman than you could one by that dog." Mr. Humphrey Pump gravely took the paper from his pocket, on which he had previously inscribed the sin and desolation of grocers, and felt in need of another of his innumerable pockets for a pencil. "Hullo!" cried Dalroy. "Are you going to have a shy at the Ballad of Quoodle?" Quoodle lifted his ears at his name. Mr. Pump smiled a slight and embarrassed smile. He was secretly proud of Dalroy's admiration for his previous literary attempts, and he had some natural knack for verse as a game, as he had for all games, and his reading, though desultory, had not been merely rustic or low. "On condition," he said deprecatingly, "that you write a song for the English." "Oh, very well," said Patrick, with a huge sigh that really indicated the very opposite of reluctance. "We must do something till the thing stops, I suppose, and this seems a blameless parlour game. Songs of the Car Club. Sounds quite aristocratic." And he began to make marks with a pencil on the fly-leaf of a little book he had in his pocket. Wilson's Noct Ambrosiane. Every now and then, however, he looked up and delayed his own composition by watching Pump and the dog, whose proceedings amused him very much, for the owner of the old ship sat sucking his pencil and looking at Mr. Quoodle with eyes of fathomless attention. Every now and then he slightly scratched his brown hair with the pencil and wrote down a word. And the dog Quoodle, with that curious canine power of either understanding or most brazenly pretending to understand what is going on, sat erect with his head at an angle, as if he were sitting for his portrait. Hence it happened that though Pump's poem was a little long, as are often the poems of inexperienced poets, and though Dalroy's poem was very short, being much hurried toward the end, the long poem was finished some time before the short one. Therefore it was that there was first produced for the world the song more familiarly known as No Noses, or more correctly called the Song of Quoodle. Part of it ran eventually thus: "They haven't got no noses, the fallen sons of Eve. Even the smell of roses is not what they supposes, but more than mind discloses, and more than men believe. They haven't got no noses, they cannot even tell When door and darkness closes The park a Jew encloses, Where even the law of Moses Will let you steal a smell. The brilliant smell of water, the brave smell of a stone, The smell of dew and thunder, and old bones buried under, Are things in which they blunder, and err if left alone. The wind from winter forests, the scent of scentless flowers, The breath of brides adorning, the smell of snare and warning, The smell of Sunday morning, God gave to us for ours. And Quoodle here discloses all things that Quoodle can. They haven't got no noses, they haven't got no noses, and goodness only noses the noselessness of man." This poem also shows traces of haste in its termination, and the present editor, who has no aim save truth, is bound to confess that parts of it were supplied in the criticisms of the captain, and even enriched in later and livelier circumstances by the poet of the birds himself. At the actual moment, the chief features of this realistic song about dogs was a crashing chorus of bow wow wow begun by Mr. Patrick Dalroy, but immediately imitated much more successfully by Mr. Quoodle. In the face of all this, Dalroy suffered some real difficulty in fulfilling the bargain by reading out his much shorter poem about what he imagined an Englishman might feel. Indeed, there was something very rough and vague in his very voice as he read it out, as of one who had not found the key to his problem. The present compiler, who has no aim save truth, must confess that the verses ran as follows: "St. George he was for England, and before he killed the dragon he drank a pint of English ale out of an English flagon, for though he fast right readily in hair shirt or in mail, it isn't safe to give him cakes unless you give him ale. St. George he was for England, and right gallantly set free the lady left for dragon's meat and tied up to a tree. But since he stood for England and knew what England means, unless you give him bacon you mustn't give him beans. St. George he was for England, and shall wear the shield he wore, when we go out in armour with the battle-cross before. But though he is jolly company and very pleased to dine, it isn't safe to give him nuts unless you give him wine." "Very philosophical song that," said Dalroy, shaking his head solemnly, "full of deep thought. I really think that is about the truth of the matter, in the case of the Englishmen. Your enemies say you're stupid, and you boast of being illogical, which is about the only thing you do that really is stupid. As if anybody ever made an empire or anything else by saying that 2 and 2 make 5. Or as if anyone was ever the stronger for not understanding anything, if it were only tip-cat or chemistry. But this is true about you, Hump. You English are supremely an artistic people, and therefore you go by associations, as I said in my song. You won't have one thing without the other thing that goes with it. And as you can't imagine a village without a squire and parson, or a college without port and old oak, you get the reputation of a conservative people. But it's because you're sensitive, Hump, not because you're stupid, that you won't part with things. It's lies and flattery they tell you, Hump, when they tell you you're fond of compromise. I tell ye, Hump, every real revolution is a compromise. D'ye think Wolfe Tone or Charles Stewart Parnell never compromised? But it's just because you're afraid of a compromise that you won't have a revolution. If you really overhauled the old ship or Oxford, you'd have to make up your mind what to take and what to leave, and it would break your heart, Humphrey Pump." He stared in front of him with a red and ruminant face, and at length added, somewhat more gloomily, "This aesthetic way we have, Pump, has only 2 little disadvantages, which I will now explain to you. The first is exactly what has sent us flying in this contraption. When the beautiful, smooth, harmonious thing you've made is worked by a new type in a new spirit, then I tell you it would be better for you 1,000 times to be living under the 1,000 paper constitutions of Condorcet and Sieyès. When the English oligarchy is run by an Englishman who hasn't got an English mind, then you have Lord Ivywood and all this nightmare, of which God could only guess the end." The car had beaten some roods of dust behind it, and he ended still more darkly. "And the other disadvantage, my amiable aesthete, is this. If ever in blundering about the planet you come on an island in the Atlantic, Atlantis let us say, which won't accept all your pretty picture, to which you can't give everything, why, you will probably decide to give nothing. You will say in your hearts, perhaps they will starve soon, and you will become for that island the deafest and the most evil of all the princes of the earth." It was already daybreak, and Pump, who knew the English boundaries almost by intuition, could tell, even through the twilight, that the tale of the little town they were leaving behind was of a new sort, the sort to be seen in the western border. The chauffeur's phrase about his mother might merely have been a music-hall joke, but certainly he had driven darkly in that direction. White morning lay about the grey stony streets like spilt milk. A few proletarian early risers, wearier at morning than most men at night, seemed merely of opinion that it was no use crying over it. The 2 or 3 last houses, which looked almost too tired to stand upright, seemed to have moved the Captain into another sleepy explosion. There are 2 kinds of idealists, as everybody knows, or must have thought of. There are those who idealize the real, and those who precious seldom realize the ideal. Artistic and poetical people like the English generally idealize the real. This I have expressed in a song which—" "No, really," protested the innkeeper. "Really now, Captain." "This I have expressed in a song," repeated Dalroy in a very adamantine manner, "which I will now sing with every circumstance of leisure, loudness, or any other—" He stopped, because the flying universe seemed to stop. Charging hedgerows came to a halt, as if challenged by the bugle. The racing forests stood rigid. The last few tottering houses stood suddenly at attention. For a noise like a pistol shot from the car itself had stopped all that race, as a pistol shot might start any other. The driver clambered out very slowly and stood about in various tragic attitudes around the car. He opened an unsuspected number of doors and windows in the car, and touched things and twisted things and felt things. "I must back as best I can to that there garage, sir," he said in a heavy and husky tone they had not heard from him before. Then he looked round on the long woods and the last houses, and seemed to gnaw his lip, like a great general who has made a great mistake. His brow seemed as black as ever, yet his voice, when he spoke again, had fallen many further degrees towards its dull and daily tone. "Yer see, this is a bit bad," he said. "It'll be a beastly job even at the best plices if I'm getting back at all." "Getting back?" repeated Dalroy, opening the blue eyes of a bull. "Back where?" "Well, yer see," said the chauffeur reasonably, "I was bloody keen to show 'im it was me drove the car and not 'im. By a bit o' bad luck I done damage to his car. Well, if you can stick in his car—" Captain Patrick Dalroy sprang out of the car so rapidly that he almost reeled and slipped upon the road. The dog sprang after him, barking furiously. "Hump," said Patrick quietly, "I've found out everything about you. I know what always bothered me about the Englishmen." Then, after an instant's silence, he said, "That Frenchman was right who said, I forget how he put it, that you marched to Trafalgar Square to rid yourself of your temper, not to rid yourself of your tyrant. Our friend was quite ready to rebel rushing away. To rebel sitting still was too much for him. Do you read Punch? I am sure you do. Pump and Punch must be almost the only survivors of the Victorian age. Do you remember an old joke in an excellent picture representing two ragged Irishmen with guns waiting behind a stone wall to shoot a landlord? One of the Irishmen says, 'The landlord is late,' and adds, 'I hope no accidents happen to the poor gentleman.' Well, it's all perfectly true. I knew that Irishman intimately, but I want to tell you a secret about him. He was an Englishman." The chauffeur had backed with breathless care to the entrance of the garage, which was next door to a milkman's, or merely separated from it by a black and lean lane, looking no larger than the crack of a door. It must, however, have been larger than it looked, because Captain Dalroy disappeared down it. He seemed to have beckoned the driver after him. At any rate, that functionary instantly followed. The functionary came out again in an almost guilty haste, touching his cap and stuffing loose papers into his pocket. Then the functionary returned yet again from what he called the garage, carrying larger and looser things over his arm. All this did Mr. Humphrey Pump observe, not without interest. The place, remote as it was evidently a rendezvous for motorists. Otherwise a very tall motorist, throttled and masked in the most impenetrable degree, would hardly have strolled up to speak to him. Still less would the tall motorist have handed him a similar horrid disguise of wraps and goggles in a bundle over his arm. Least of all would any motorist, however tall, have said to him from behind the cap and goggles, "Put on these things, Hump, and then we'll go into the milk shop. I'm waiting for the car." "Which car, my seeker after truth?" "Why, the car I'm going to buy for you to drive." The remorseful chauffeur, after many adventures, did actually find his way back to the little moonlit wood where he had left his master and the donkey. But his master and the donkey had vanished. End of chapter 15. Recording by Nicole K. Of the Flying Inn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicola K. The Flying Inn by G. K. Chesterton. Chapter 16. The 7 Moods of Durian. That timeless clock of all lunatics, which was so bright in the sky that night, may really have had some elfin luck about it, like a silver penny. Not only had it irritated Mr. Hibbs into the mysteries of Dionysius, and Mr. Bullrose into the arboreal habits of his ancestors, but one night of it made a very considerable and rather valuable change in Mr. Dorian Wimpole, the poet of the birds. He was a man neither foolish nor evil, any more than Shelley; only a man made sterile by living in a world of indirectness and insincerity, with words rather than with things. He had not had the smallest intention of starving his chauffeur. He did not realize that there was worse spiritual murder in merely forgetting him. But as hour after hour passed over him, alone with the donkey and the moon, he went through a raging and shifting series of frames of mind such as his cultured friends would have described as moods. The first mood, I regret to say, was one of black and grinding hatred. He had no notion of the chauffeur's grievance, and could only suppose he had been bribed or intimidated by the demonic donkey torturers. But Mr. Wimpole was much more capable at that moment of torturing a chauffeur than Mr. Pump had ever been of torturing a donkey. For no sane man can hate an animal. He kicked the stones into the road, sending them flying into the forest, and wished that each one of them was a chauffeur. The bracken by the roadside he tore up by the roots, as representing the hair of the chauffeur, to which it bore no resemblance. He hit with his fist such trees as I suppose seemed in form and expression most reminiscent of the chauffeur, but desisted from this, finding that in this apparently one-sided contest the tree had rather the best of it. But the whole wood and the whole world had become a kind of omnipresent and pantheistic chauffeur, and he hit at him everywhere. The thoughtful reader will realize that Mr. Wimpole had already taken a considerable upward stride in what he would have called the cosmic scale. The next best thing to really loving a fellow creature is really hating him, especially when he is a poorer man, separated from you otherwise by mere social stiffness. The desire to murder him is at least an acknowledgment that he is alive. Many a man has owed the first white gleams of the dawn of democracy in his soul to a desire to find a stick and beat the butler. And we have it on the unimpeachable local authority of Mr. Humphrey Pump that Squire Merriman chased his librarian through 3 villages with a horse pistol, and was a radical ever after. His rage also did him good merely as a relief, and he soon passed into a second and more positive mood of meditation. "The damnable monkeys go on like this," he muttered, "and then they call the donkey one of the lower animals. Ride on a donkey, would he? I'd like to see the donkey riding on him for a bit. Good old man." The patient ass turned mild eyes on him when he patted it, and Durian Wimpole discovered with a sort of subconscious surprise that he really was fond of the donkey. Deeper still in his subliminal self he knew that he had never been fond of an animal before. His poems about fantastic creatures had been quite sincere and quite cold. When he said he loved a shark, he meant he saw no reason for hating a shark, which was right enough. There is no reason for hating a shark, however much reason there may be for avoiding one. There is no harm in a kraken if you keep it in a tank or in a sonnet. But he also realized that his love of creatures had been turned round and was working from the other end. The donkey was a companion and not a monstrosity. It was dear because it was near, not because it was distant. The oyster had attracted him because it was utterly unlike a man, unless it be counted a touch of masculine vanity to grow a beard. The fancy is no idler than that he had himself used, in suggesting a sort of feminine vanity in the permanence of a pearl. But in that maddening vigil among the mystic pines, he found himself more and more drawn toward the donkey, because it was more like a man than anything else around him, because it had eyes to see and ears to hear, and the latter even unduly developed. "He that hath ears to hear, let him hear," he said, scratching those grey hairy flappers with affection. "Haven't you lifted your eyes toward heaven? And will you be the first to hear the last trumpet?" The ass rubbed his nose against him with what seemed almost like a human caress. and Dorian caught himself wondering how a caress from an oyster could be managed. Everything else around him was beautiful, but inhuman. Only in the first glory of anger could he really trace in a tall pine tree the features of an ex-taxicab man from Kennington. Trees and ferns had no living ears that they could wag, nor mild eyes that they could move. He patted the donkey again. But the donkey had reconciled him to the landscape, and in his third mood he began to realize how beautiful it was. On a second study he was not sure it was so inhuman. Rather he felt that its beauty at least was half human, that the aureole of the sinking moon behind the woods was chiefly lovely because it was like the tender-coloured aureole of an early saint, and that the young trees were, after all, noble because they held up their heads like virgins. Cloudily there crowded into his mind ideas with which it was imperfectly familiar, especially an idea which he had heard called the image of God. It seemed to him more and more that all these things, from the donkey to the very docks and ferns by the roadside, were dignified and sanctified by their partial resemblance to something else. It was as if they were baby drawings, the wild, crude sketches of nature in her first sketch-books of stone. He had flung himself on a pile of pine needles to enjoy the gathering darkness of the pine woods as the moon sank behind them. There is nothing more deep and wonderful than really impenetrable pine woods, where the nearer trees show against the more shadowy, a tracery of silver upon grey, and of grey upon black. It was by this time in pure pleasure and idleness that he picked up a pine needle to philosophize about it. "Think of sitting on needles," he said. "Yet I suppose this is the sort of needle that Eve in the old legend used in Eden. Aye, and the old legend was right, too. Think of sitting on all the needles in London. Think of sitting on all the needles in Sheffield. Think of sitting on any needles except on all the needles of Paradise. Oh yes, the old legend was right enough. The very needles of God are softer than the carpets of men." He took a pleasure in watching the weird little forest animals creeping out from under the green curtains of the wood. He reminded himself that in the old legend they had been as tame as the ass, as well as being as comic. He thought of Adam naming the animals, and said to a beetle, "I should call you Budger." The slugs gave him great entertainment, and so did the worms. He felt a new and realistic interest in them which he had not known before. It was indeed the interest that a man feels in a mouse in a dungeon, the interest of any man tied by the leg and forced to see the fascination of small things. Creatures of the wormy kind, especially, crept out at very long intervals. Yet he found himself waiting patiently for hours for the pleasure of their acquaintance. One of them rather specially arrested his eye because it was a little longer than most worms, and seemed to be turning its head in the direction of the donkey's left foreleg. Also, it had a head to turn, which most worms have not. Dorian Wimpole did not know much about exact natural history, except what he had once got up very thoroughly from an encyclopedia for the purposes of a sympathetic villanelle. But as this information was entirely concerned with the conjectural causes of laughter in the hyena, it was not directly helpful in this case. But though he did not know much natural history, he knew some. He knew enough to know that a worm ought not to have a head, and especially not a squared and flattened head, shaped like a spade or a chisel. He knew enough to know that a creeping thing with a head of that pattern survives in the English countrysides, though it is not common. In short, he knew enough to step across the road and set a sharp and savage boot heel on the neck and spine of the creature, breaking it into 3 black bits that writhed once more before they stiffened. Then he gave out a great explosive sigh. The donkey, whose leg had been in such danger, looked at the dead adder with eyes that had never lost their moony mildness. Even Dorian himself looked at it for a long time, and with feelings he could neither arrest nor understand, before he remembered that he had been comparing the little wood to Eden. "And even in Eden," he said at last. And then the words of Fitzgerald failed upon his lips. And while he was warring with such words and thoughts, something happened about him and behind him. Something he had written about 100 times and read about 1,000. Something he had never seen in his life. It flung faintly across the broad foliage a wan and pearly light, far more mysterious than the lost moonshine. It seemed to enter through all the doors and windows of the woodland, pale and silent, but confident, like men that keep a tryst. Soon its white robes had threads of gold and scarlet, and the name of it was Morning. For some time past, loud and in vain, all the birds had been singing to the poet of the birds. But when that minstrel actually saw broad daylight breaking over wood and road, the effect on him was somewhat curious. He stood staring at it in gaping astonishment until it had fulfilled the fullness of its shining fate, and the pine cones and the curling ferns and the live donkey and the dead viper were almost as distinct as they could be at noon, or even in a pre-Raphaelite picture. And then the fourth mood fell upon him like a bolt from the blue, and he strode across and took the donkey's bridle as if to lead it along. "Damn it all!" he cried, in a voice as cheerful as the cock-crow that rang recently from the remote village. "It's not everybody who's killed a snake." Then he added reflectively, "I bet Dr. Gluck never did. Come along, donkey, let's have some adventures." The finding and fighting of positive evil is the beginning of all fun, and even of all farce. All the wild woodland looked jolly now the snake was killed. It was one of the fallacies of his literary clique to refer all natural emotions to literary names, but it might not untruly be said that he had passed out of the mood of Maeterlinck into the mood of Whitman, and out of the mood of Whitman into the mood of Stevenson. He had not been a hypocrite when he asked for gilded birds of Asia, or purple polypi out of the southern seas. He was not a hypocrite now when he asked for mere comic adventures along a common English road. It was his misfortune and not his fault if his first adventure was his last, and was much too comic to laugh at. Already the wan morning had warmed into a pale blue, and was spotted with those little plump pink clouds which must surely have been the origin of the story that pigs might fly. The insects of the grass chattered so cheerfully that every green tongue seemed to be talking. The skyline on every side was broken only by objects that encouraged such swashbucklering comedy. There was a windmill that Chaucer's miller might have inhabited, or Cervantes' champion charged. There was an old leaden church spire that might have been climbed by Robert Clive. Away toward Pebblewick and the sea, there were the 2 broken stumps of wood which Humphrey Pump declares to this day to have been the stands for an unsuccessful children's swing, but which tourists always accept as the remains of the antique gallows. In the gaiety of such surroundings, it is small wonder if Dorian and the donkey stepped briskly along the road. The very donkey reminded him of Sancho Panza. He did not wake out of this boisterous reverie of the white road and the wind till a motor horn had first hooted and then howled, till the ground had shaken with the shock of a stoppage, and till a human hand fell heavily and tightly on his shoulder. He looked up and saw the complete costume of a police inspector. He did not worry about the face, and there fell on him the 5th or unexpected mood, which is called by the vulgar astonishment. In despair he looked at the motor car itself that had anchored so abruptly under the opposite hedge. The man at the steering wheel was so erect and unresponsive that Dorian felt sure he was feasting his eyes on yet another policeman. But on the seat behind was a very different figure, a figure that baffled him all the more because he felt certain he had seen it somewhere. The figure was long and slim with sloping shoulders, and the costume, which was untidy, yet contrived to give the impression that it was tidy on other occasions. The individual had bright yellow hair, one lock of which stuck straight up and was exalted, like the little horn in his favourite scriptures. Another tuft of it, in a bright but blinding manner, fell across and obscured the left optic, as in literal fulfilment of the parable of a beam in the eye. The eyes, with or without beams in them, looked a little bewildered, and the individual was always nervously resettling his necktie. For the individual went by the name of Hibbs, and had only recently recovered from experiences wholly new to him. "What on earth do you want?" asked Wimpole of the policeman. His innocent and startled face, and perhaps other things about his appearance, evidently caused the inspector to waver. "Well, it's about this 'ere donkey, sir," he said. "Do you think I stole it?" cried the indignant aristocrat. "Well, of all the mad worlds! A pack of thieves steal my limousine, I save their damned donkey's life at the risk of my own, and I'm run in for stealing." The clothes of the indignant aristocrat probably spoke louder than his tongue. The officer dropped his hand, and after consulting some papers in his hand, walked across to consult with the unkempt gentleman in the car. "That seems to be a similar cart and donkey," Durian heard him saying, "but the clothes don't seem to fit your description of the men you saw." Now Mr. Hibbs had extremely vague and wild recollections of the men he saw. He could not even tell what he had done and what he had merely dreamed. If he had spoken sincerely, he would have described a sort of green nightmare of forests, in which he found himself in the power of an ogre about 12 feet high, with scarlet flames for hair, and dressed rather like Robin Hood. But a long course of what is known as keeping the party together had made it as unnatural to him to tell anyone, even himself, what he really thought about anything, as it would have been to spit or to sing. He had at present only 3 motives and strong resolves. 1. Not to admit that he had been drunk. 2. Not to let anyone escape whom Lord Ivywood might possibly want to question. And 3. Not to lose his reputation for sagacity and tact. "This party has a brown velvet suit, you see, and a fur overcoat," the inspector continued, "and in the notes I have from you, you say the man wore a uniform." "When we say uniform," said Mr. Hibbs, frowning intellectually, "when we say uniform, of course we must distinguish some of our friends who don't quite see eye to eye with us, you know," and he smiled with tender leniency. "Some of our friends wouldn't like it called a uniform, perhaps. But, of course, well, it wasn't a police uniform, for instance." "Ha! Ha!" "I should hope not," said the official shortly. "So, in a way, however," said Hibbs, clutching his verbal talisman at last, "it might be brown velvet in the dark." The inspector replied to this helpful suggestion with some wonder. "But it was a moon, like limelight," he protested. "Yars, yars!" cried Hibbs in a high tone that can only be described as a hasty drawl. "Yars, discolours everything, of course, the flowers and things." "But look here," said the inspector, "you said the principal man's hair was red." A blonde type," said Hibbs, waving his hand with a solemn lightness. "Reddish, yellowish, brownish sort of hair, you know." Then he shook his head and said with the heaviest solemnity the word was capable of carrying, "Teutonic, purely Teutonic." The inspector began to feel some wonder that, even in the confusion following on Lord Ivywood's fall, he had been put under the guidance of this particular guide. The truth was that Leveson, once more masking his own fears under his usual parade of hurry, had found Hibbs at a table by an open window, with wild hair and sleepy eyes, picking himself up with some sort of medicine. Finding him already fairly clear-headed in a dreary way, he had not scrupled to use the remains of his bewilderment to despatch him with the police in the first pursuit. Even the mind of a semi-recovered drunkard, he thought, could be trusted to recognize anyone so unmistakable as the captain. But though the diplomatist's debauch was barely over, his strange, soft fear and cunning were awake. He felt fairly certain the man in the fur coat had something to do with the mystery, as men with fur coats do not commonly wander about with donkeys. He was afraid of offending Lord Ivywood, and at the same time afraid of exposing himself to a policeman. "You have large discretion," he said gravely. "Very right you should have large discretion in the interests of the public. I think you would be quite authorized, for the present, in preventing the man's escape." "And the other man?" inquired the officer with knitted brow. "Do you suppose he has escaped?" "The other man," repeated Hibbs, however, regarding the distant windmill through the half=closed lids, as if this were a new fine shade introduced into an already delicate question. "Well, hang it all," said the police officer, "you must know whether there were two men or one." Gradually it dawned, in a grey dawn of horror, over the brain of Hibbs that this was what he specially couldn't know. He had always heard and read in comic papers that a drunken man sees double, and beholds two lamp posts, one of which is, as the higher critic would have said, purely subjective. For all he knew, being a mere novice, inebriation might produce the impression of the two men in his dreamlike adventure, when in truth there had only been one. "Two men, you know, one man," he said with a sort of moody carelessness. "Well, we can go into their numbers later. They can't have a very large following." Here he shook his head very firmly. "Quite impossible. And as the late Lord Goschen used to say, you can prove anything by statistics." And here came an interruption from the other side of the road. "And how long am I to wait here for you and your Goschens, you silly goat?" were the intemperate wood notes issuing from the poet of the birds. "I'm shot if I'll stand this. Come along, donkey, and let's pray for a better adventure next time. These are very inferior specimens of your own race." And seizing the bridle of the ass again, he strode past them swiftly, and almost as if urging the animal to a gallop. Unfortunately, this disdainful dash for liberty was precisely what was wanting to weigh down the rocking intelligence of the inspector on the wrong side. If Wimpole had stood still a minute or two longer, the official, who was no fool, might have ended in disbelieving Hibbs's story altogether. As it was, there was a scuffle, not without blows on both sides, and eventually the Honourable Dorian Wimpole, donkey and all, was marched off to the village, in which there was a police station, in which was a temporary cell, in which a sixth mood was experienced. His complaints, however, were at once so clamorous and so convincing, and his coat was so unquestionably covered with fur, that after some questioning and cross purposes they agreed to take him in the afternoon to Ivywood House, where there was a magistrate incapacitated by a shot only recently extracted from his leg. They found Lord Ivywood lying on a purple ottoman in the midst of his Chinese puzzle of Oriental apartments. He continued to look away as they entered, as if expecting with Roman calm the entrance of a recognized enemy. But Lady Enid Wimpole, who was attending to the wants of the invalid, gave a sharp cry of astonishment, and the next moment the three cousins were looking at each other. One could almost have guessed they were cousins, all being, as Mr. Hibbs subtly put it, a blonde type. But two of the blonde types expressed amazement, and one blonde type merely rage. "I am sorry, Durian," said Ivywood, when he had heard the whole story. "These fanatics are capable of anything, I fear, and you very rightly resent their stealing your car." "You are wrong, Philip," answered the poet emphatically. "I do not even faintly resent their stealing my car. What I do resent is the continued existence on God's earth of this fool," pointing to the serious Hibbs, "and of that fool," pointing to the inspector, "and, yes, by thunder, of that fool too," and he pointed straight at Lord Ivywood. "And I tell you frankly, Philip, if there really are, as you say, two men who are bent on smashing your schemes and making your life a hell, I am very happy to put my car at their disposal. And now I'm off." "You'll stop to dinner?" inquired Ivywood with frigid forgiveness. "No, thanks," said the disappearing bard. "I'm going up to town." The seventh mood of Dorian Wimpole had a grand finale at the Café Royal. and consisted largely of oysters. End of chapter 16. Recording by Nicola K.
Of the Flying Inn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Flying Inn by G.K. Chesterton. Chapter 17. The Poet in Parliament. During the singular entrance and exit of Dorian Wimpole, M.P., J.P., etc., Lady Joan was looking out of the magic casements of that turret room which was now literally, and not only poetically, the last limit of Ivywood House. The old broken hole and black staircase up which the lost dog Quoodle used to come and go, had long ago been sealed up and cemented with a wall of exquisite Eastern workmanship. All through the patterns Lord Ivywood had preserved and repeated the principle that no animal shape must appear. But like all lucid dogmatists, he perceived all the liberties his dogma allowed him, and he irradiated this remote end of Ivywood with sun and moon and solar and starry systems, with the Milky Way for a dado and a few comets for comic relief. The thing was well done of its kind, as were all the things that Philip Ivywood got done for him, and if all the windows of the turret were closed with their peacock curtains, a poet with anything like a Hibbsian appreciation of the family champagne might almost fancy he was looking out across the sea on a night crowded with stars. And, what was yet more important, even Misysra, that exact thinker, could not call the moon a live animal without falling into idolatry. But Joan, looking out of real windows on a real sky and sea, thought no more about the astronomical wallpaper than about any other wallpaper. She was asking herself in sullen emotionalism, and for the thousandth time, a question she had never been able to decide. It was the final choice between an ambition and a memory, and there was this heavy weight in the scale, that the ambition would probably materialize and the memory probably wouldn't. It has been the same weight in the same scale a million times since Satan became the prince of this world. But the evening stars were strengthening over the old seashore, and they also wanted weighing, like diamonds. As once before at the same stage of brooding, she heard behind her the swish of Lady Enid's skirts, that never came so fast, save for a serious cause. "Joan, please do come. Nobody but you, I do believe, could move him." Joan looked at Lady Enid and realized that the lady was close on crying. She turned a trifle pale, and asked quietly for the question. "Philip says he's going to London now, with that leg and all," cried Enid, "and he won't let us say a word." "But how did it all happen?" asked Joan. Lady Enid Wimpole was quite incapable of explaining how it all happened, so the task must for the moment devolve on the author. The simple fact was that Ivywood, in the course of turning over magazines on his sofa, happened to look at a paper from the Midlands. "The Turkish news," said Mr. Leveson, rather nervously, "is on the other side of the page." But Lord Ivywood continued to look at the side of the paper that did not contain the Turkish news, with the same dignity of lowered eyelids and unconscious brow with which he had looked at the captain's message when Joan found him by the turret. On the page covered merely with casual provincial happenings was a paragraph: "Echo of Pebblewick mystery. Reported reappearance of the Vanishing Inn." Underneath was printed in smaller letters: "An almost incredible report from Whittington announces that the mysterious sign of the old ship has once more been seen in this country, though it has long been relegated by scientific investigators to the limbo of old rustic superstitions. According to the local version, Mr. Simmons, a dairyman of Whittington, was serving in his shop when two motorists entered, one of them asking for a glass of milk. They were in the most impenetrable motoring panoply, with darkened goggles and waterproof collars turned up, so that nothing can be recalled of them personally, except that one was a person of unusual stature. In a few moments this latter individual went out of the shop again and returned with a miserable specimen out of the street, one of the tattered loafers that linger about our most prosperous towns, tramping the streets all night, and even begging in defiance of the police. The filth and disease of the creature were so squalid that Mr. Simmons at first refused to serve him with the glass of milk which the taller motorist wished to provide for him. At length, however, Mr. Simmons consented, and was immediately astonished by an incident against which he certainly had a more assured right to protest. The taller motorist, saying to the loafer, "But, man, you're blue in the face," made a species of signs to the smaller motorist, who thereupon appears to have pierced a sort of cylindrical trunk or chest that seemed to be his only luggage, and drawn from it a few drops of a yellow liquid, which he deliberately dropped into the ragged creature's milk. It was afterward discovered to be rum, and the protests of Mr. Simmons may be imagined. The tall motorist, however, warmly defended his action, having apparently some wild idea that he was doing an act of kindness. "Why, I found the man nearly fainting," he said. "If you'd picked him off a raft, he couldn't be more collapsed with cold and sickness; and if you'd picked him off a raft, you'd have given him rum. Yes, by St. Patrick, if you were a bloody pirate, and made him walk the plank afterward." Mr. Simmons replied with dignity that he did not know how it was with rafts, and could not permit such language in his shop. He added that he would lay himself open to a police prosecution if he permitted the consumption of alcohol in his shop, since he did not display a sign. The motorist then made the amazing reply, "But you do display a sign, you jolly old man. Did you think I couldn't find my way to the sign of the Old Ship, you sly boots?" Mr. Simmons was now fully convinced of the intoxication of his visitors, and, refusing a glass of rum rather boisterously offered him, went outside his shop to look round for a policeman. To his surprise, he found the officer engaged in dispersing a considerable crowd, which was staring up at some object behind him. On looking round, he states in his deposition, he saw what was undoubtedly one of the low tavern signs at one time common in England. He was wholly unable to explain its presence outside his premises, and as it undoubtedly legalized the motorist's action, the police declined to move in the matter. Later, the two motorists have apparently left the town unmolested, in a small second hand two-seater. There is no clue to their destination except it be indicated by a single incident. It appears that when they were waiting for the second glass of milk, one of them drew attention to a milk can of a shape seemingly unfamiliar to him, which was, of course, the mountain milk now so much recommended by doctors. The taller motorist, who seemed in every way strangely ignorant of modern science and social life, asked his companion where it came from, receiving, of course, the reply that it is manufactured in the model village of Peaceways, under the personal superintendence of its distinguished and philanthropic inventor, Dr. Meadows. Upon this, the taller person, who appeared highly irresponsible, actually bought the whole can, observing, as he tucked it under his arm, that it would help him to remember the address. Later, our readers will be glad to hear that the legend of the Old Ship sign has once more yielded to the wholesome skepticism of science. Our representative reached Whittington after the practical jokers, or whatever they were, had left. But he searched the whole frontage of Mr. Simmons's shop, and we are in a position to assure the public that there is no trace of the alleged sign. Lord Ivywood laid down the newspaper, and looked at the rich and serpentine embroideries on the wall, with the expression that a great general might have if he saw a chance of really ruining his enemy, if he would also ruin all his previous plans of campaign. His pallid and classic profile was as immovable as a cameo, but anyone who had known him at all would have known that his brain was going like a motor car that had broken the speed limit long ago. Then he turned his head and said, "Please tell Hicks to bring round the long blue car in half an hour. It can be fitted up for a sofa. And ask the gardener to cut a pole of about 4 feet 9 inches, and put a crosspiece for a crutch. I'm going to London to night." Mr. Levison's lower jaw literally fell with astonishment. "The doctor said 3 weeks," he said. "If I may ask it, where are you going?" St. Stephen's, Westminster, answered Ivywood. Surely, said Mr. Leveson, I could take a message. You could take a message, assented Ivywood. I'm afraid they would not allow you to make a speech. It was a moment or two afterward that Enid Wimpole had come into the room and striven in vain to shake his decision. Then it was that Joan had been brought out of the turret and saw Philip standing, sustained upon a crutch of garden timber, and admired him as she had never admired him before. While he was being helped downstairs, while he was being propped in the car with such limited comfort as possible, she did really feel in him something worthy of his ancient roots, worthy of such hills and of such a sea, for she felt God's wind from nowhere, which is called the will, and is man's only excuse upon this earth. In the small toot of the starting motor she could hear 100 trumpets, such as might have called her ancestors and his to the glories of the Third Crusade. Such imaginary military honors were not, at least in the strategic sense, undeserved. Lord Ivywood really had seen the whole map of the situation in front of him, and swiftly formed a plan to meet it, in a manner not unworthy of Napoleon. The realities of the situation unrolled themselves before him, and his mind was marking them one by one as with a pencil. First, he knew that Dalroy would probably go to the model village. It was just the sort of place he would go to. He knew Dalroy was almost constitutionally incapable of not kicking up some kind of row in a place of that kind. Second, he knew that if he missed Dalroy at this address, it was very likely to be his last address. He and Mr. Pump were quite clever enough to leave no more hints behind. Third, he guessed by careful consideration of map and clock that they could not get to so remote a region in so cheap a car under something like 2 days, nor do anything very conclusive in less than 3. Thus he had just time to turn round in. Fourth, he realized that ever since that day when Dalroy swung round the signboard and smote the policeman into the ditch, Dalroy had swung round the Ivywood Act on Lord Ivywood. He, Lord Ivywood, had thought, and might well have thought rightly, that by restricting the old signposts to a few places so select that they can afford to be eccentric, and forbidding such artistic symbols to all other places, he could sweep fermented liquor, for all practical purposes, out of the land. The arrangement was exactly that at which all such legislation is consciously or unconsciously aiming. A signboard could be a favor granted by the governing class to itself. If a gentleman wished to claim the liberties of a Bohemian, the path would be open. If a Bohemian wished to claim the liberties of a gentleman, the path would be shut. So, gradually, Lord Ivywood had thought, the old signs which can alone sell alcohol will dwindle down to mere curiosities like audit ale or the mead that may still be found in the New Forest. The calculation was by no means unstatesmanlike, but like many other statesmanlike calculations, it did not take into account the idea of dead wood walking about. So long as his flying foes might set up their sign anywhere, it mattered little whether the result was enjoyment or disappointment for the populace. In either case it must mean constant scandal or riot. If there was one thing worse than the appearance of the old ship, it was its disappearance. He realized that his own law was letting them loose every time, for the local authorities hesitated to act on the spot in defiance of a symbol now so exclusive and therefore impressive. He realized that the law must be altered at once, must be altered, if possible, before the fugitives broke away from the model village of Peaceways. He realized that it was Thursday. This was the day on which any private member of Parliament could introduce any private bill of the kind called non-contentious, and pass it without a division, so long as no particular member made any particular fuss. He realized that it was improbable that any particular member would make any particular fuss about Lord Ivywood's own improvement on Lord Ivywood's own act. Finally, he realized that the whole case could be met by so slight an improvement as this: change the words of the act, which he knew by heart, as happier men might know a song. If such a sign be present, liquids containing alcohol can be sold on the premises, to these other words: liquids containing alcohol can be sold if previously preserved for 3 days on the premises. It was mate in a few moves. Parliament could never reject or even examine so slight an emendation, and the revolution of the "old ship" and the late King of Ithaca would be crushed for ever. It does undoubtedly show, as we have said, something Napoleonic in the man's mind that the whole of this excellent and even successful plan was complete long before he saw the great glowing clock on the towers of Westminster and knew he was in time. It was unfortunate, perhaps, that about the same time, or not long after, another gentleman of the same rank and indirectly of the same family, having left the restaurant in Regent Street and the tangle of Piccadilly, had drifted serenely down Whitehall and had seen the same great golden goblin's eye on the tall tower of St. Stephen. The poet of the birds, like most aesthetes, had known as little of the real town as he had of the real country, but he had remembered a good place for supper, and as he passed certain great cold clubs, built of stone and looking like Assyrian sarcophagi, he remembered that he belonged to many of them, and so when he saw afar off, sitting above the river, what had been very erroneously described as the best club in London, he suddenly remembered that he belonged to that too. He could not at the moment recall what constituency in South England it was that he sat for, but he knew he could walk into the place if he wanted to. He might not have so expressed the matter, but he knew that in an oligarchy things go by respect for persons and not for claims, by visiting cards and not by voting cards. He had not been near the place for years, being permanently paired against a famous patriot who had accepted an important government appointment in a private madhouse. Even in his silliest days he had never pretended to feel any respect for modern politics, and made all haste to put his leaders and the mad patriot's leaders on the well-selected list of the creatures whom man forgets. He had made one really eloquent speech in the House on the subject of guerrillas, and then found he was speaking against his party. It was an indescribable sort of place, anyhow. Even Lord Ivywood did not go to it except to do some business that could be done nowhere else, as was the case that night. Ivywood was what is called a peer by courtesy. His place was in the Commons, and for the time being on the opposition side, but though he visited the House but seldom, he knew far too much about it to go into the chamber itself. He limped into the smoking room, though he did not smoke, procured a needless cigarette and a much needed sheet of note paper, and composed a curt but careful note to the one member of the government whom he knew must be in the House. Having sent it up to him, he waited. Outside, Mr. Dorian Wimpole also waited, leaning on the parapet of Westminster Bridge and looking down the river. He was becoming one of the oysters in a more solemn and solid sense than he had hitherto conceived possible, and also with a strictly vegetarian beverage which bears the noble and starry name of Nuits. He felt at peace with all things, even in a manner with politics. It was one of those magic hours of evening when the red and golden lights of men are already lit along the river, and look like the lights of goblins, but daylight still lingers in a cold and delicate green. He felt about the river something of that smiling and glorious sadness which two Englishmen have expressed under the figure of the white wood of an old ship fading like a phantom, Turner in painting and Henry Newbolt in poetry. He had come back to earth like a man fallen from the moon. He was at bottom not only a poet but a patriot, and a patriot is always a little sad. Yet his melancholy was mixed up with that immutable yet meaningless faith which few Englishmen, even in modern times, fail to feel at the unexpected sight either of Westminster or of that height on which stands the Temple of St. Paul. "While flows the sacred river, while stands the sacred hill," he murmured in some schoolboy echo of the ballad of Lake Regillus. "While flows the sacred river, while stands the sacred hill, the proud old pantaloons and nincompoops who yawn at the very length of their own lies in that accursed Sanhedrim where people put each other's hats on, in a poisonous room, with no more windows than hell, shall have such honour still." Relieved by this rendering of Macaulay in the style known among his cultured friends as vers libre, or poesy set free from the shackles of formal metre, he strolled toward the members' entrance and went in. Lacking Lord Ivywood's experience, he strolled into the Commons Chamber itself, and sat down on a green bench, under the impression that the House was not sitting. He was, however, gradually able to distinguish some 6 or 8 drowsy human forms from the seats on which they sat, and to hear a senile voice, with an Essex accent, saying, all on one note, and without beginning or end, in a manner which is quite impossible to punctuate: "No wish at all that this proposal should be regarded except in the right way, and have tried to put it in the right way, and cannot think the honourable member was altogether adding to his reputation in putting it in what those who think we must of course consider the wrong way, and I for one am free to say that if in his desire to settle this great question he takes this hasty course and this revolutionary course about slate pencils, he may not be able to prevent the extremists behind him from applying it to lead pencils, and while I should be the last to increase the heat and the excitement and the personalities of this debate if I could possibly help it, I must confess that in my opinion the honourable gentleman has himself encouraged that heat and personality in a manner that he now doubtless regrets. I have no desire to use abusive terms, indeed you, Mr. Speaker, would not allow me of course to use abusive terms, but I must tell the honourable member face to face that the perambulators with which he has twitted me cannot be germane to this discussion. I should be the last person—" Dorian Wimpole had softly risen to go, when he was arrested by the sight of someone sliding into the house and handing a note to the solitary young man with heavy eyelids who was at that moment governing all England from the Treasury bench. Seeing him go out, Dorian had a sickening sweetness of hope, as he might have said in his earlier poems, that something intelligible might happen after all, and followed him out almost with alacrity. The solitary and sleepy governor of Great Britain went down into the lower crypts of its temple of freedom, and turned into an apartment where Wimpole was astonished to see his cousin Ivywood sitting at a little table with a large crutch leaning beside him, as serene as Long John Silver. The young man with the heavy eyelids sat down opposite him, and they had a conversation which Wimpole, of course, did not hear. He withdrew into an adjoining room, where he managed to procure coffee and a liqueur, an excellent liqueur which he had forgotten, and of which he had more than one glass. But he had so posted himself that Ivywood could not come out without passing him, and he waited for what might happen with exquisite patience. The only thing that seemed to him queer was that every now and then a bell rang in several rooms at once, and whenever the bell rang Lord Ivywood nodded as if he were part of the electrical machinery. And whenever Lord Ivywood nodded, the young man turned and sped upstairs like a mountaineer, returning in a short time to resume the conversation. On the third occasion the poet began to observe that many others from the other rooms could be heard running upstairs at the sound of this bell, and returning with the slightly less rapid step which expresses relief after a duty done. Yet did he not know that this duty was representative government, and that it is thus that the cry of Cumberland or Cornwall can come to the ears of an English king? Suddenly the sleepy young man sprang erect, uninspired by any bell, and strode out once more. The poet could not help hearing him say as he left the table, jotting down something with a pencil: "Alcohol can be sold if previously preserved for 3 days on the premises. I think we can do it, but you can't come on for half an hour." Saying this, he darted upstairs again, and when Dorian saw Ivywood come out laboriously afterward on his large country crutch, he had exactly the same revulsion in his favour that Joan had had. Jumping up from his table, which was in one of the private dining rooms, he touched the other on the elbow and said: "I want to apologize to you, Philip, for my rudeness this afternoon. Honestly, I am sorry. Pine woods and prison cells try a man's temper. but I had no rag of excuse for not seeing that for neither of them were you to blame. I'd no notion you were coming up to town tonight, with your leg and all. You mustn't knock yourself up like this. Do sit down a minute." It seemed to him that the bleak face of Philip softened a little. How far he really softened will never be known until such men as he are understood by their fellows. It is certain that he carefully unhooked himself from his crutch and sat down opposite his cousin, whereupon his cousin struck the table so that it rang like a dinner bell, and called out, "Waiter!" as if he were in a crowded restaurant. Then, before Lord Ivywood could protest, he said, "It's awfully jolly that we've met. I suppose you've come up to make a speech. I should like to hear it. We haven't always agreed, but, by God, if there's anything good left in literature, it's your speeches reported in a newspaper. That thing of yours that ended 'Death and the last shutting of the iron doors of defeat,' why, you must go back to Strafford's last speech for such English. Do let me hear your speech. I've got a seat upstairs, you know." "If you wish it," said Ivywood hurriedly, "but I shan't make much of a speech tonight." And he looked at the wall behind Wimpole's head, with thunderous wrinkles thickening on his brow. It was essential to his brilliant and rapid scheme, of course, that the Commons should make no comment at all on his little alteration in the law. An attendant hovered near in response to the demand for a waiter, and was much impressed by the presence and condition of Lord Ivywood. But as that exalted cripple resolutely refused anything in the way of liquor, his cousin was so kind as to have a little more himself, and resumed his remarks. "It's about this public house affair of yours, I suppose? I'd like to hear you speak on that. Perhaps I'll speak myself. I've been thinking about it a good deal all day, and a good deal of last night too. Now, here's what I should say to the House if I were you. To begin with, can you abolish the public house? Are you important enough now to abolish the public house? Whether it's right or wrong, can you, in the long run, prevent haymakers having ale any more than you can prevent me having this glass of chartreuse?" The attendant, hearing the word, once more drew near, but heard no further order, or rather, the orders he heard were such as he was less able to cope with. "Remember the curate?" said Durian abstractedly, shaking his head at the functionary. "Remember the sensible little High Church curate, who, when asked for a temperance sermon, preached on the text, 'Suffer us not to be overwhelmed in the water floods'? Indeed, indeed, Philip, you are in deeper waters than you know. You will abolish ale. You will make Kent forget hop poles, and Devonshire forget cider. The fate of the inn is to be settled in that hot little room upstairs. Take care its fate and yours are not settled in the inn. Take care Englishmen don't sit in judgment on you as they do on many another corpse at an inquest, at a common public house. Take care that the one tavern that is really neglected and shut up and passed like a house of pestilence is not the tavern in which I drink tonight, and that merely because it is the worst tavern on the King's highway. Take care this place where we sit does not get a name like any pub where sailors are hocussed or girls debauched. That is what I shall say to them," said he, rising cheerfully. "That's what I shall say. See you to it," he cried with a sudden passion, and apparently to the waiter. "See you to it if the sign that is destroyed is not the sign of the Old Ship, but the sign of the Mace and Bauble. And, in the words of a highly historical brewer, if we see a dog bark at your going." Lord Ivywood was observing him with a deathly quietude. Another idea had come into his fertile mind. He knew his cousin, though excited, was not in the least intoxicated. He knew that he was quite capable of making a speech, and even a good one. He knew that any speech, good or bad, would wreck his whole plan, and send the wild inn flying again. But the orator had resumed his seat and drained his glass, passing a hand across his brow. And he remembered that a man who keeps a vigil in the wood all night, and drinks wine on the following evening, is liable to an accident that is not drunkenness, but something much healthier. "I suppose your speech will come on pretty soon?" said Dorian, looking at the table. "You'll let me know when it does, of course. Really and truly, I don't want to miss it. And I've forgotten all the ways here and feel pretty tired. You'll let me know?" "Yes," said Lord Ivywood. Stillness fell along all the rooms, until Lord Ivywood broke it by saying, "Debate is a most necessary thing, but there are times when it rather impedes than assists parliamentary government." He received no reply. Dorian still sat as if looking at the table, but his eyelids had lightly fallen. He was asleep. Almost at the same moment the member of government, who was nearly asleep, appeared at the entrance of the long room and made some sort of weary signal. Phillip Ivywood raised himself on his crutch and stood for a moment looking at the sleeping man. Then he and his crutch trailed out of the long room, leaving the sleeping man behind. Nor was that the only thing that he left behind. He also left behind an unlighted cigarette, and his honor, and all the England of his fathers. Everything that could really distinguish that high house beside the river from any tavern for the hocussing of sailors. He went upstairs and did his business in 20 minutes, in the only speech he had ever delivered without any trace of eloquence. And from that hour forth he was the naked fanatic, and could feed on nothing but the future. End of chapter 17. The Poet in Parliament.
Chapter 18 of The Flying Inn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicola Kay. The Flying Inn by G.K. Chesterton. Chapter 18. The Republic of Peaceways. In a hamlet round about Windermere, let us say, or somewhere in Wordsworth's country, there could be found a cottage, in which could be found a cottager. So far all is as it should be. And the visitor would first be conscious of a hearty and even noisy elderly man, with an apple face and a short white beard. This person would then loudly proffer to the visitor the opportunity of seeing his father, a somewhat more elderly man with a somewhat longer white beard, but still up and about. And these two together would then initiate the neophyte into the joys of the society of a grandfather, who was more than 100 years old, and still very proud of the fact. This miracle, it seemed, had been worked entirely on milk. The subject of this diet the oldest of the three men continued to discuss in enormous detail. For the rest, it might be said that his pleasures were purely arithmetical. Some men count their years with dismay, and he counted his with a juvenile vanity. Some men collect stamps or coins, and he collected days. Newspaper men interviewed him about the historic times through which he had lived, without eliciting anything whatever, except that he had apparently taken to an exclusive milk diet at about the age when most of us leave it off. Asked if he was alive in 1815, he said that was the very year he found it wasn't any milk but must be mountain milk, like Dr. Meadows says. Nor would his calculating creed of life have allowed him to understand you if you had said that in a meadowland over sea that lies before the city of Brussels, boys of his old school in that year gained the love of the gods and died young. It was the philanthropic Dr. Meadows, of course, who discovered this deathless tribe, and erected on it the whole of his great dietetic philosophy, to say nothing of the houses and dairies of Peaceways. He attracted many pupils and backers among the wealthy and influential. Young men who were, so to speak, training for extreme old age, infant old men, embryo nonagenarians. It would be an exaggeration to say that they watched joyfully for the first white hair as Fascination Fledgeby watched for his first whisker. But it is quite true to say that they seemed to have scorned the beauty of woman and the feasting of friends, and above all, the old idea of death with glory, in comparison with this vision of the sports of second childhood. Peaceways was in its essential plan much like what we call a garden city, a ring of buildings where the work people did their work, with a pretty ornamental town in the centre, where they lived in the open country outside. This was no doubt much healthier than the factory system in the great towns, and may have partly accounted for the serene expression of Dr. Meadows and his friends, if any part of the credit can be spared from the splendours of mountain milk. The place lay far from the common highways of England, and its inhabitants were enabled to enjoy their quiet skies and level woods almost undisturbed, and fully absorb whatever may be valuable in the Meadows' method and view, until one day a small and very dirty motor drove into the middle of their town. It stopped beside one of those triangular islets of grass that are common at forked roads, and two men in goggles, one tall and the other short, got out and stood on the central space of grass, as if they were buffoons about to do tricks, as indeed they were. Before entering the town they had stopped by a splendid mountain stream, quickening and thickening rapidly into a river, unhelmed and otherwise eased themselves, eaten a little bread bought at Whittington, and drank the water of the widening current which opened on the valley of Peaceways. "I'm beginning quite to like water," said the taller of the two knights. "I used to think it a most dangerous drink. In theory, of course, it ought only to be given to people who are fainting. It's really good for them, much better than brandy. Besides, think of wasting good brandy on people who are fainting. But I don't go so far as I did. I shouldn't insist on a doctor's prescription before I allow people water. That was the too severe morality of youth. That was my innocence and goodness. I thought that if I fell once, water drinking might become a habit. But I do see the good side of water now. How good it is when you're really thirsty. How it glitters and gurgles. How alive it is. After all, it's the best of drinks, after the other. As it says in the song, 'Feast on wine or fast on water, and your honour shall stand sure. God Almighty's son and daughter, he the valiant, she the pure. If an angel out of heaven brings you other things to drink, thank him for his kind intentions. Go and pour them down the sink.' Tea is like the East he grows in, a great yellow mandarin, with urbanity of manner and unconsciousness of sin. All the women, like a harem, at his pigtail troop along, and, like all the East he grows in, he is poison when he's strong. Tea, although an Oriental, is a gentleman at least. Cocoa is a cad and coward. Cocoa is a vulgar beast. Cocoa is a dull, disloyal, lying, crawling cad and clown, and may very well be grateful to the fool that takes him down. As for all the windy waters, they were rained like trumpets down, when good drink had been dishonoured by the tipplers of the town, when red wine had brought red ruin, and the death dance of our times, heaven sent us soda water as a torment for our crimes. Upon my soul, this water tastes quite nice. I wonder what vintage now." And he smacked his lips with solemnity. "It tastes just like the year 1881 tasted." "You can fancy anything in the tasting way," returned his shorter companion. "Mr. Jack, who was always up to his tricks, did serve plain water in those little glasses they drink liqueurs out of, and everyone swore it was a delicious liqueur and wanted to know where they could get it, all except old Admiral Guffin, who said it tasted too strong of olives. But water's much the best for our game, certainly." Patrick nodded, and then said, "I doubt if I could do it, if it weren't for the comfort of looking at that," and he kicked the rum keg, "and feeling we shall have a good swig at it some day. It feels like a fairy tale carrying that about, as if rum were a pirate's treasure, as if it were molten gold. Besides, we can have such fun with it with other people. What was that joke I thought of this morning? Oh, I remember. Where's that milk can of mine?" For the next 20 minutes he was industriously occupied with his milk can and the cask, Pump watching him with an interest amounting to anxiety. Lifting his head, however, at the end of that time, he knotted his red brows and said, "What's that?" "What's what?" asked the other traveller. "That," said Captain Patrick Dalroy, and pointed to a figure approaching on the road parallel to the river. "I mean, what's it for?" The figure had a longish beard and very long hair falling far below its shoulders. It had a serious and steadfast expression. It was dressed in what the inexperienced Mr. Pump at first took to be its nightgown, but afterward learned it to be its complete goat's hair tunic, unmixed even with a thread of the destructive and deadly wool of the sheep. It had no boots on its feet. It walked very swiftly to a particular turn of the stream, and then turned very sharply, since it had accomplished its constitutional, and walked back toward the perfect town of Peaceways. "I suppose it's somebody from that milk place," said Humphrey Pump indulgently. "They seem to be pretty mad." "I don't mind that so much," said Dalroy. "I'm mad myself sometimes. But a madman has only one merit and last link with God. A madman is always logical. Now, what is the logical connection between living on milk and wearing your hair long?" "Most of us lived on milk when we had no hair at all." "How do they connect it up? Are there any heads even for a synopsis? Is it, say, milk, water, shaving, hair? Is it milk, kindness, unkindness, convicts, hair? What is the logical connection between having too much hair and having far too few boots? What can it be? Is it hair trunk, leather boots? Is it hair, beard, oysters, seaside, paddling, no boots? Man is liable to err, especially when every mistake he makes is called a movement. But why should all the lunacies live together?" "Because all the lunatics should live together," said Humphrey, "and if you'd seen what happened up at Crampton with the farming out idea, you'd know. It's all very well, Captain, but if people can prevent a guest of great importance being buried up to the neck in farm manure, they will. They will, really." He coughed almost apologetically. He was about to attempt a resumption of the conversation when he saw his companion slap the milk can and keg back into the car and get into it himself. "You drive," he said. "Drive me where those things live. You know, Hump." They did not, however, arrive in the civic centre of such things without yet another delay. They left the river and followed the man with the long hair and the goatskin frock, and he stopped as it happened at a house on the outskirts of the village. The adventurers stopped also, out of curiosity, and were at first relieved to see the man almost instantly reappear, having transacted his business with a quickness that seemed incredible. A second glance showed them it was not the man, but another man dressed exactly like him. A few minutes more of inquisitive delay showed them many of the kilty and goatish sect going in and out of this particular place, each clad in his innocent uniform. "This must be the temple and chapel," muttered Patrick. "It must be here they sacrifice a glass of milk to a cow, or whatever it is they do. Well, the joke is pretty obvious, but we must wait for a lull in the crowding of the congregation." When the last long-haired phantom had faded up the road, Dalroy sprang from the car and drove the signboard deep into the earth with savage violence, and then very quietly knocked at the door. The apparent owner of the place, of whom the two last of the long-haired and barefooted idealists were taking a rather hurried farewell, was a man curiously ill-fitted for the part he seemed cast for in the only possible plot. Both Pump and Dalroy thought they had never seen a man look so sullen. His face was of the rubicund sort that does not suggest jollity, but merely a stagnant indigestion in the head. His moustache hung heavy and dark, his brows yet heavier and darker. Dalroy had seen something of the sort on the faces of defeated people disgracefully forced into submission, but he could not make head or tail of it in connection with the priggish perfections of Peaceways. It was all the odder because he was manifestly prosperous. His clothes were smartly cut in something of the sporting manner, and the inside of his house was at least 4 times grander than the outside. But what mystified the most was this, that he did not so much exhibit the natural curiosity of a gentleman whose private house is entered by strangers, but rather an embarrassed and restless expectation. During Dalroy's eager apologies and courteous inquiries about the direction and accommodations of Peaceways, his eye, which was of the boiled gooseberry order, perpetually wandered from them to the cupboard and then again to the window, and at last he got up and went to look out into the road. "Oh, yes, sir, very healthy place, Peaceways," he said, peering through the lattice. "Very. Dash it, what do they mean? A very healthy place. Of course they have their little ways." "Only drink pure milk, don't they?" asked Dalroy. The householder looked at him with a rather wild eye and grunted. "Yes, so they say," and he went again to the window. "I've bought some of it," said Patrick, patting his pet milk can, which he carried under his arm as if unable to be separated from Dr. Meadows' discovery. "Have a glass of milk, sir." The man's boiled eye began to bulge in anger or some other emotion. "What do you want?" he muttered. "Are you Tex or what?" "Agents and distributors of the Meadows Mountain milk," said the captain with simple pride. "Taste it?" The dazed householder took a glass of the blameless liquid and sipped it, and the change on his face was extraordinary. "Well, I'm jiggered," he said with a broad and rather coarse grin. "That's a queer dodge. You're in the joke, I see." Then he went again restlessly to the window and added, "But if we're all friends, why the blazes don't the others come in? I've never known trade so slow before." "Who are the others?" asked Mr. Pump. "Oh, the usual Peaceways people," said the other. "They generally come here before work. Dr. Meadows don't work them for very long hours, that wouldn't be healthy or whatever he calls it, but he's particular about their being punctual. I've seen 'em running with all their pure-minded togs on, when the hooter gave the last call." Then he abruptly opened the front door and called out impatiently, but not loudly, "Come along in if you're coming. You'll give the show away if you play the fool out there." Patrick looked out also, and the view of the road outside was certainly rather singular. He was used to crowds, large and small, collecting outside houses which he had honoured with the sign of the Old Ship, but they generally stared up at it in unaffected wonder and amusement. But outside this open door some 20 or 30 persons in what Pump had called their nightgowns were moving to and fro like somnambulists, apparently blind to the presence of the sign, looking at the other side of the road, looking at the horizon, looking at the clouds of morning, and only occasionally stopping to whisper to each other. But when the owner of the house called to one of these ostentatiously abstracted beings and asked him hoarsely what the devil was the matter, it was natural for the milk-fed one to turn his feeble eye toward the sign. The gooseberry eyes followed his, and the face to which they belonged was a study in apoplectic astonishment. "What the hell have you done to my house?" he demanded. "Of course they can't come in if this thing's here." "I'll take it down if you like," said Dalroy, stepping out and picking it up like a flower from the front garden, to the amazement of the men in the road, who thought they had strayed into a nursery fairy tale. "But I wish in return you'd give me some idea of what the blazes all this means." "Wait till I've served these men," replied his host. The goat-garbed persons went very sheepishly or goatishly into the now signless building, and were rapidly served with raw spirits, which Mr. Pump suspected to be of no very superior quality. When the last goat was gone, Captain Dalroy said, "I mean that all this seems to me topsy-turvy. I understood that as the law stands now, if there's a sign, they are allowed to drink, and if there isn't, they aren't." "The law?" said the man in a voice thick with scorn. "Do you think these poor brutes are afraid of the law as they are of the doctor?" "Why should they be afraid of the doctor?" asked Dalroy innocently. "I always heard that Peaceways was a self-governing republic." "Self-governing be damned," was the illiberal reply. "Don't he own all the houses and could turn 'em out in a snowstorm? Don't he pay all the wages and could starve 'em stiff in a month? The law!" And he snorted. A moment after, he squared his elbows on the table and began to explain more fully. "I was a brewer about here and had the biggest brewery in these parts. There were only 2 houses which didn't belong to me, and the magistrates took away their licenses after a time. 10 years ago you could see Hugby's Ales written beside every sign in the county. Then came these cursed radicals, and our leader, Lord Ivywood, must go over to their side about it, and let this doctor buy all the land under some new law that there shan't be any pubs at all. And so my business is ruined, so that he can sell his milk. Luckily I'd done pretty well before and had some compensation, of course, and I still do a fair trade on the QT, as you see. But of course that don't amount to half the old one, for they're afraid of old Meadows finding out. Snuffling old blighter." And the gentleman with the good clothes spat on the carpet. "I'm a radical myself," said the Irishman rather coldly. "For all information on the Conservative Party I must refer you to my friend Mr. Pump, who is, of course, in the inmost secrets of his leaders. But it seems to me very rum sort of radicalism to eat and drink at the orders of a master who is a madman, merely because he's also a millionaire. O Liberty, what very complicated and even unsatisfactory social developments are committed in thy name. Why don't they kick the old ass round the town a bit? No boots? Is that why they're allowed no boots? Oh, roll 'em downhill in a milk can. You can't object to that." "I don't know," said Pump in his ruminant way. "Master Christian's aunt did, but ladies are more particular, of course." "Look here," cried Dalroy in some excitement, "if I stick up that sign outside and stay here to help, will you defy them? You'd be strictly within the law, and any private coercion I can promise you they shall repent. Plant the sign and sell the stuff openly like a man, and you may stand in English history like a deliverer." Mr. Hugby of Hugby's Ales only looked gloomily at the table. His was not the sort of drinking nor the sort of drink selling on which the revolutionary sentiment flourishes. "Well," said the Captain, "will you come with me and say 'Hear, hear,' and how true? What matchless eloquence! If I make a speech in the market-place? Come along. There's room in our car." "Well, I'll come with you if you like," replied Mr. Hugby heavily. "It's true if yours is allowed we might get our trade back too." And putting on a silk hat he followed the Captain and the innkeeper out to their little car. The model village was not an appropriate background for Mr. Hugby's silk hat. Indeed, the hat seemed somehow to bring out by contrast all that was fantastic in the place. It was a superb morning, some hours after sunrise. The edges of the sky, touching the ring of dim woods and distant hills, were still jewelled with the tiny transparent clouds of daybreak, delicate red and green or yellow. But above the vault of heaven rose through turquoise into a torrid and solid blue in which the other clouds, the colossal cumuli, tumbled about like a celestial pillow fight. The bulk of the houses were as white as the clouds, so that it looked, to use another simile, as if some of the whitewashed cottages were flying and falling about the sky. But most of the white houses were picked out here and there with bright colours, here an ornament in orange or there a stripe of lemon yellow, as if by the brush of a baby giant. The houses had no thatching. Thatching is not hygienic, but were mostly covered with a sort of peacock green tiles bought cheap at a pre-Raphaelite bazaar, or less frequently by some still more esoteric sort of terracotta bricks. The houses were not English, nor homelike, nor suited to the landscape, for the houses had not been built by free men for themselves, but at the fancy of a whimsical lord. But considered as a sort of elfin city in a pantomime, it was a really picturesque background for pantomimic proceedings. I fear Mr. Dalroy's proceedings from the first rather deserved that name. To begin with, he left the sign, the cask, and the keg all wrapped and concealed in the car, but removed all the wraps of his own disguise, and stood on the central patch of grass in that green uniform that looked all the more insolent for being as ragged as the grass. Even that was less ragged than his red hair, which no red jungle of the East could imitate. Then he took out, almost tenderly, the large milk can, and deposited it, almost reverently, on the island of turf. Then he stood beside it, like Napoleon beside a gun, with an expression of tremendous seriousness and even severity. Then he drew his sword, and with that flashing weapon as with a flail, lashed and thrashed the echoing metal can till the din was deafening, and Mr. Hugby hastily got out of the car and withdrew to a slight distance, stopping his ears. Mr. Pump sat solidly at the steering wheel, well knowing it might be necessary to start in some haste. "Gather! Gather! Gather, Peaceways!" shouted Patrick, still banging on the can and lamenting the difficulties of adapting McGregor's gathering to the name and occasion. "We're landless, 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 Peaceways!" Two or three of the goat-clad, recognizing Mr. Hugby with a guilty look, drew near with great caution, and the captain shouted at them as if they were an army covering Salisbury Plain. "Citizens," he roared, saying anything that came into his head, "try the only original, unadulterated mountain milk, for which alone Mahomet came to the mountain. The original milk of the land flowing with milk and honey, the high quality of which could alone have popularized so unappetizing a combination. Try our milk. None others are genuine. Who can do without milk? Even whales can't do without milk. If any lady or gentleman keeps a favorite whale at home, now's their chance. The early whale catches the milk. Just look at our milk. If you say you can't look at the milk because it's in the can, well, look at the can. You must look at the can. You simply must. When duty whispers low, thou must." He bellowed at the top of his voice in a highly impromptu peroration. "When duty whispers low, thou must," the youth replies. "I can." And with the word "can," he hit the can with a shocking and shattering noise, like a peal of demoniac bells of steel. This introductory speech is open to criticism from those who regard it as intended for the study rather than the stage. The present chronicler, who has no aim save truth, is bound to record that for its own unscrupulous purpose it was extremely successful, a great mass of the citizens of Peaceways having been attracted by the noise of one man shouting like a crowd. There are crowds who do not care to revolt, but there are no crowds who do not like someone else to do it for them, a fact which the safest oligarchs may be wise to learn. But Dalroy's ultimate triumph, I regret to say, consisted in actually handing to a few of the foremost of his audience some samples of his blameless beverage. The fact was certainly striking. Some were paralyzed with surprise. Some were abruptly broken double with laughter. Many chuckled. Some cheered. All looked radiantly toward the eccentric orator. And yet the radiance died quietly and suddenly from their faces, and only because one little old man had joined the group, a little old man in white linen, with a white pointed beard and a white powder puff of hair like thistledown, a man whom almost every man present could have killed with the left arm. End of chapter 18. Recording by Nicole K.